Okay, so let's begin. Welcome everyone to our webinar, Subscription Payments in High Growth Markets. I have a few points of webinar logistics and housekeeping notes, followed by some introductions. So this webinar is being recorded. We'll make the recording available to those who've registered, and we plan to send a survey as well. As questions occur to you throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A feature highlighted here at the bottom of your webinar frame. And as questions come in, moderators will see them and be able to disposition them at the end. And so that we can better follow up with you, please don't check the box that says ask anonymously. In case we get too many questions, we'd want to follow up with you afterward. And of course, if you have a problem with the audio or visual, please also use the Q&A button, and our moderators will note that, and we'll try to mitigate what happens. So with those logistics aside, I should mention that today is brought to you by Aria Systems, a leader in cloud billing and monetization, and Worldline, a leader in global payments. So our invitations to this event asked, are you interested in expanding into new high growth markets but unsure of how to conduct business like a local? Well, we're fortunate today to have a great lineup of featured speakers to share actionable insights on how to successfully grow recurring revenue in the world's most promising and high growth markets. So joining today from Worldline is Michael Bellotta, Head of Global Digital Goods and Services for the Digital Commerce Division. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Mike. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be one of the 4 mics of this webinar.
Good point. Also from Worldline is Michael Connolly, Director of Channel Partnerships, focusing on digital commerce and subscription billing solutions. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great having you here. And joining from Aria Systems is Mike Judge, VP of Product Management, where his role is product delivery and strategy, and his background and expertise is both in SaaS billing and in payments. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Mike. Nice to be Mike number 3.
And I'm your host, Mike Carroll, Mike number 4, a product marketing director at Aria Systems. And plenty of mics are welcome also in the audience. I actually see 1 or 2, so we're chock full of mics. So anyway, let's take a look at our agenda. We'll begin by looking at a couple of market forces that are in play, and then we'll look at both the opportunities and the challenges of global expansion of a recurring revenue business. We'll discuss global merchants and local billing, and we'll look at global solutions for local payments. And we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. So please do use the Q&A button, and we'll get to that. I'll hand it over to Mike Judge of Aria Systems.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you all for joining us today. We're very happy to have you with us. Today, we open with this recent study result from IDC. This shows just how much of an impact the pandemic has had and will have on online commerce. Right? This projection is US only, but that trend is being reported to us from our merchants and other analysts across the globe. Driven by lockdowns and concerns over personal safety, new users are driven online everywhere, and new and existing online shoppers are going to come to rely on digital commerce more than ever before. This unprecedented boost is driving digital merchants everywhere to expand into new businesses and into new geographies. And that's our topic today. With such expansion, it's not without its challenges, but the rewards can be great. Operating in a single country can be enough of a challenge. Growing to serve multiple regions at once requires very careful thought and preparation. Doing business across multiple geographies requires a balancing act between specialization for local offerings and standardization for a scalable, sustainable business. Each location can come with its own requirements and expectations, and they must be met to be successful. Now, these are just a few of the examples our clients have tackled in this past year alone. We have a number of North America and EU-centric merchants growing into Latin America and into Brazil, one of the biggest economies there in particular, and we're helping them through all of the challenges that you see listed here, as well as just the standards of a business expanding. We also have a number of customers in the EU and in Asia Pac growing into India and dealing with the different payments and billing landscape there. And certainly most of our customers have some interaction with the UK, which has gone in and out of different regulatory approaches due to the Brexit situation. So a lot of challenges for these guys, and maintaining this situation doesn't require them to maintain different system stacks. It requires a merchant to implement one that has flexibility to handle both the local and the global at each touch point. Orchestration with rules that are aware of location, offering details, customer preference are going to be critical to success here. Now, while payment methods and taxation are the most well-known differentiators when you talk about global business, they're only part of what you need to manage in order to succeed. But as we said at the top of the webinar, there's amazing opportunity for success here. And with that, I will let Michael Bellata from Worldline speak to some of the high growth market value that we see.
Mike Judge, thank you, sir. Everyone on the webinar, thank you again for joining. When we talk about these high growth markets, as we covered in the last slide, of course, there are going to be challenges. At Worldline, we like to focus in on what is typically called the BRIC countries. And on this slide, I'll really hone our focus in on Brazil, Russia, and India. So the first three of there's now 5 BRICS, I think. Maybe there's 6, I'm not sure, it keeps expanding, but we'll focus on the first 3, Brazil, Russia, and India. So Mike, on the last slide, talked about the challenges. There are challenges, right? So if we look at Brazil, there's a very unique payment ecosystem there that we'll dive into a little bit later in the session. In Russia, there's obstacles around data warehousing, and of course, there's always the geopolitical concerns of that country. And in India, they have a long history of a regime of currency controls. However, and as with many things in life, those hurdles are not in a silo, and oftentimes those hurdles are accompanied by massive opportunities. So on this slide, as a precursor of what we'll dive into later, I will cover some of those. So if we start with Russia, who's sort of let's start with Brazil, actually. It's in the middle of your screen. And I think Mike Carroll is being very helpful with his best Vanna White impression. Brazil is I would say it's in the scale up. If we draw a parallel to the startup environment, it's in the scale up phase of its e-commerce development. It's quite a healthy proportion of their overall population to the size of the e-commerce market, particularly if you compare it to India. And there is also quite a prevalence of card payments. So if you scroll your eyes all the way to the right-hand side, you'll see a pie chart, which I'll be referencing for the other 2 countries as well. For Brazil, what you see is that 56% of payments, e-commerce payments done in that country are done through credit cards or debit cards, which is quite interesting because one of the things that we'll be talking about throughout the webinar, at least from a payments perspective, is the prevalence of alternative methods of payment within these fast-growing markets. One of the unique aspects of Brazil that is to be contended with by merchants is one, installment payments, I'll cover that later, and also boletos, boleto bancário. And that is like a cash voucher payment system, super unique. You see it in some of these other expanding markets as well. So if we move on to Russia, which is in the bottom third of the page right now, Russia is a massive e-commerce market per capita. So if you see the population of Russia in 2019, 144 million against an e-commerce total market size of 44 billion in the year 2020. It's second only to China on this graph in terms of what the actual ratio is. So it's quite a mature market. And if we go over to the pie chart quickly, what you'll see is that in contrast to Brazil, in Russia, cards are actually outweighed by alternative methods of payment. They have some interesting ones there, such as Kiwi and Yandex. These are similar to Boleto. They're sort of a voucher kiosk type of solution. And lastly, let me touch on India before we move forward. And what you'll see there is that it's the least mature market from an e-commerce perspective, with a population in 2019 of 1.4 billion and quite a small comparative e-commerce market size of 46 billion. And then again, we go back to our trusty pie chart. What you'll see there is the biggest disparity between what here we're calling LPMs, what oftentimes are called APMs, which is alternative methods of payment, 62% in contrast with 30% cards. And what you'll also see in India is that it's quite a cash heavy country still, with 8% coming in there. So if any of this perked your interest, we will be going into LATAM and India later in the webinar. But until then, I will hand it back to Mike Judge to take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, sir. So next, I wanted to talk about 4 key components that help you expand your billing and payment strategy into new markets, specifically into new geographies. In a billing system, flexibility means being able to selectively configure these 4 key areas. The experience of your customers, your product offerings, the people and processes that drive your back office behind the scenes, and most commonly, your payment strategy are going to want to be differentiated in order to succeed when you're stretching into new geographies, to match the local needs without sacrificing the economies of scale and scope you get from being one business behind the scenes. You start with understanding the new markets from a customer point of view. Not only should you consider key items like language and currency, but ensure that you can model, offer, and support relevant products in a sustainable way, making the most of shared resources. But determine the cultural and legal differences between a new market and your current operations first, and then choose what can be shared and what must be separated or altered to suit that new locale. Each of these 4 areas offers a wealth of opportunities to intelligently balance your local with your global approach. And in the coming slides, we'll share a few words about each one from our perspective. The challenge with customers is that they're people. They're at once individuals and groups, members of a nation or part of a global customer base. But it's here you can make the most impact that the customers themselves will see. You set the terms for how you communicate with your customers. You want to use their language and branded terminology that makes sense for who they are and where they live. You want to pay attention to the frequency and types of communication that they expect or their locale may require. Your offering may or may not be country or language specific. It doesn't have to be, but your communications can be and should be. So look for a way to be able to separate that and be able to manage that as part of the whole. But also take advantage of this chance to segment your customers and prospects in the billing system itself so that you can choose to alternatively see them as members of one or more groups or as part of the whole. In Aria, our clients use a number of tools to do this, including customer groups like functional account groups to affect the segment, or things like billing groups or collection groups, where they can dictate locally aware payment and collections or dunning approaches to specific segments of the customers in a non-destructive way. Also consider account hierarchy to recognize a customer's relationship to others, or even to themselves, right? They can be represented separately or collectively in all of their forms. One example is a customer with multiple locations or addresses in a single country, or a customer who has locations or addresses in multiple countries, or somebody who has separate divorceable data. And by that, I mean things like separate wallets that they want to maintain, separate sets of permissions, separate sets of features that for one reason or another, they need to be divorceable, but still sometimes treated as a whole. You can accomplish this behind the scenes with a hierarchy, even if they are presented a single customer presence. And of course, real hierarchies matter too. Real family members, each of which might have their own child accounts, real businesses, each of which might have subsidiaries that have their own spider web of billing structures. And all of this is possible when you use a flexible billing implementation strategy. Now, grouping strategies give you control and visibility to the new region or the business, both separate from and as part of your overall business. Be aware that some grouping strategies can draw hard boundaries that you silo when needed, and especially when data residency or data sovereignty comes into play, you'll want to employ those. But most are soft and malleable and can be changed over time or arbitrarily to suit your business needs. Now, segment these customers all without sacrificing the ability to represent their individual needs and preferences, such as currency and pay methods and communication type and frequency. Now, with the who planned out, the next area to tackle, the next most important area is the what. Look to your product catalog. To your buyer, the offer is always a local experience. You can facilitate this with flexible offering of product catalogs capable of reusing services across any number of subscription plans, packages, or bundles. This can start with simple things like alternative naming and languages, but go deeper into billing. Each offer in the catalog should be able to support any number of predefined or custom overridable pricing lists in multiple currencies or even different contexts, for partners, for not for partners, for people in a certain community. Any context you can think of, you should be able to develop a rate schedule or pricing strategy separate while still reusing the core product catalog objects, so that a relatively small catalog can offer products from across the globe. Geographic requirements are not just about currency. The desired revenue model itself may vary by country or region, right? What's popular, what's expected, or what the payment methods or legal situation promote for you to be able to offer and manage and sustain in a particular market. All should be considered, and you should not lightly consider that a particular offering has to be offered in a particular model. Find what works and configure to be able to offer them together. Another thing about pricing, psychological pricing always has to take into account the person and the locale, right? The way their currency rounds and what they might expect. So when you see $1.99 in the US or £1.50, you have to recognize how that currency and how that user expects to see pricing and be able to allow for that in your actual customer-facing pricing model. Now, how you incent a person or a community varies too. So consider building your promotional capabilities to support this with relevant discounts and coupons that are culturally and regionally appropriate and tie with the partners that they would expect to be part of this when you create your campaign strategies. And remember, how you require payment can be just as important as the method you support itself. So consider developing automated dunning collections and payment routing workflow that are rule-based and dynamic, so that situations can dictate how they get charged, when they get charged, and through what vehicle. Now, finally, as part of the product catalog, tax. Tax is always local, right? It's the customer address, the service address, the delivery address, your legal status and location. Those are all the biggest factors in determining who, how, and what to tax. So you need to ensure your system, when you are going into multiple geographies, is capable of supporting these differing tax requirements, far beyond just calculation. It's remittance and tracking and separation, in some cases communication, right? Latin American countries are famous for requiring copies of the invoice data or point of sale information at the time that the sale is made, not just when you're filing taxes after the fact. So there are going to be regionally sensitive mechanisms that go far beyond calculating the appropriate tax for that country and that locale. And so all of that has to be something that you can configure and make individualized, not just to the customer, but to the customer's specific service combination of location and product. Now, with customers and products sorted, now it's time to make sure that the people and processes who run your business have the same abilities to balance the specific and the general. So let's talk about the back office. The back office can't be ignored if you want to succeed when you're serving multiple lines of business or multiple markets from the same center. You may want self-care and agent care to be regional for language reasons, for cultural alignment, for time zones, but even for cost savings, where you have a call center or an agent group in a particular locale. And you can do this by establishing channels and user permission groups in your billing and throughout the billing into the connected CRM and ERP and finance tools to ensure that the back office experience is as tailored to the market as you need it to be. Now, reporting and finance always need to be part of this, right? They need to be ready for the different payment methods, the different currencies, and potentially local and multiple providers and partners that are going to drive how they establish their accounts and how they attract those accounts. And this is more than just classifying products and transactions. It's actually enacting automated business rules that control how every interaction, customer facing or not, behaves in a manner that's going to fit your requirements, but also those of the region from a legal perspective and a business perspective. Now, nowhere are these rules going to be more important than in constructing transactions and in routing and reacting to payments. You need to ensure that these rules reflect both how you charge and how you collect. So let's talk about payments a little bit too. Now, between regulatory pressure aimed at protecting customers from fraud and giving them greater control over their data, and the major card associations weighing in with more and more prescriptive rules based off their own liabilities, digital payments are getting more and more complex for merchants, not less. This is magnified when local cards and payment method types are involved. As Michael Bellata said, alternative payment methods and local options are going to be the norm in some areas and a good idea in most anyway, but consider them along with the local expectations and demand when choosing your recurring revenue model as well as your payment strategy. A recurring revenue model is more than just offering subscriptions. It's matching the value you deliver to how customers pay. One of the values of the ever popular subscription is that people pay as they start to receive service, and they pay over time with a commitment strategy that's dictated by you, but can clearly align to them with what they pay for it. Subscriptions are obviously the most popular and ever growing. They offer a very intuitive, easy to understand and predictable path to the customer. It's a win-win because it offers steady revenue for you and steady service for them, and also promotes situations like step-up pricing and trials, which are very popular around the globe. But there are other recurring revenue models to consider. Usage or consumption-based services are the norm in certain verticals and industries, but they're also growing across the board. In places where automatic renewal is constrained, a usage-based service allows customers to pay as they go, or at least pay as they consume. And they offer that special win-win to merchants and consumers in times like these, where there's variable cost to consider or a range of demand, or where a money-conscious customer wants to pay only for and as they use services. And of course, one-time services can't be ignored. In places where there are add-ons or upgrades that are one-time services, where there are nice-to-haves and additional product lines you might want to sell. But also in areas, as was mentioned before, with India, where new rules are constraining how recurring automatic renewal is going to behave. In India, the RBI is effecting this year a new regulation requiring that merchants send an email the day before an automatic renewal to every customer, giving them the opportunity to opt out. This is going to put a strain on some of the effectiveness of automated renewals and affect your retention. In cases like this, a one-time offer can give you a way to offer a non-evergreen subscription approach. And finally, hybrid models offer a real promise for balancing the benefits of consumption and predictable costs, but they require special billing and payment rules beyond just worrying about the geographies. So when you want to balance a core subscription or a freemium offer with usage and tiered-based billing with an overage model, or additional, again, add-ons and upgrades provided with one-time fees. Now, recognize that the recurring relationship is what's driving the subscription or recurring revenue model. And look at that recurring relationship and its opportunities to design your revenue model, and then pair it with the market and the right payment method. So let's talk a little bit about that. Each recurring model has a different mix of opportunity and demand. Each payment method is suited to one or the other, and consider them iteratively to come up with the models that make sense for you. We suggest starting with the demands of your service delivery, what frequency of charging and entitlement makes sense for the products you are delivering to your customers, but then look at how your customers receive them and how they perceive and align value, and ensure that you are charging as you're delivering value for long-term retention success. And then look at what payment methods suit those, right? At each different stage and each different type, there are going to be some payment methods that are better suited than others for particular recurring models. Consider whether there's customer interaction involved. Consider how malleable to changing amounts and changing frequency of billing a particular payment method might be, and then suit that to the model. We consider this an iterative process. Do your homework up front, pick the models that make the most sense for you, but be prepared to tune these as you go and find one that's going to work for you and for your particular customer audience. As part of that, we suggest considering the 4 key points in the subscription or recurring revenue lifecycle separately. These are going to be differentiated in that there's a different presence of the customer, different specialized risk needs, and as you go, and especially over time, there's going to be a changing state of the relationship, right? Trust is going to grow or shrink depending in some part about their life on your subscription. So things to consider: first, there's the shopping area. Look at trial and conversion as your watchwords. Low friction info collection is critical to success at this point. And what is considered low friction is going to vary by geographies, by market, by culture, right? There are some where they expect, and it's the norm, to do a lot of registration up front before they ever buy anything. There are other places where it's going to be expected that they either fill out information slowly without even knowing it, or they expect to do that after the fact, only when they've committed to you, right? You can really interrupt the process. And so what really drives conversion and acquisition needs to be looked at and considered from that angle. Now, once that's done, the initial payment tends to be the most critical payment. And it's maybe the last one that you're going to ever have in an ideal situation, the customer on hand, right? Hopefully everything goes automated after that, and they're just a source of revenue for a long time. As part of this, consider the special handling you need up front to construct that initial payment, but also to deal with errors, right? This is a unique situation with the customer online that you can react to errors in a way that can have a meaningful long-term impact on your retention. Certainly when we talk about globalization, we're going to talk about things like 3D secure or strong customer authentication. And this is going to be the point where they have to interact. There's also going to be a number of payment methods where there's customer interaction up front, from the standard PayPal logging in and approving that billing agreement to Bono Bancario, like Michael mentioned, where they're going to at least have to do some printing of the boletos to be able to take to go and pay later. So consider this, again, with the customer online, is your best chance for resolving errors in a non-automated fashion and having immediate impact. But renewals are going to happen, and hopefully they're automated. So optimize for risk and cost, making sure that you give as much grace period as your risk tolerance can allow, because digital payments are almost never 100%. Right? Credit cards famously initially succeed about 82 to 83% of the time. And that's where a platform such as ours and Worldline will help you get optimized to get the additional payments, but you have to build for it. You want to automate and also personalize that retention, as I said before, for market, for the customer's expectations, but also suit the payment method. There are going to be different payment methods with different customer requirements, and consider that in what you offer and how you support it. And finally, at this stage, communicate. There is always some value to ensuring the customer is aware of what they billed for. Now, there are some times where you don't want that to be front and center. You don't want to remind them, especially for low ticket recurring items. You don't want an opportunity for churn if you don't need one, but you need to be aware of what the payment method regulations are, what the local regulations are, and make sure that that data is available and presented. And again, the local requirements come to the fore, like we just mentioned with India, where there's going to be a requirement that you send an email with opt-out information at every renewal point. Now, the last stage I want to talk about is the mid-period change. This can be a great thing. It could be an upgrade. It could be, sadly, a downgrade, or it could be a cancellation. This is a chance for you to react to that in between the normal automated billing. And again, it needs to be culturally and location sensitive. But there's also local and payment method specific rules governing proration and change. Obvious examples of that are UK direct debit and SEPA direct debit in the EU, where there's an extended right of return, right? There are controls over how variable the pricing can be on a regular basis, but also when you do make a change, when you can prorate, how you can prorate, and how you have to react to a refund situation when somebody returns a service. But this is not all bad. This is an opportunity for cross-sell and upsell. This is an opportunity to consider low touch or no touch scalable services like consumption-based models usage, where it goes up when they use it and down when they don't. And that suits certain payment methods and is expected in certain locales. But also it's a win-back opportunity. Retention offers do work, and they can balance the same flexible payments approach that the initial payment did in some cases, where you can bring the customer back to the decision point and sell them again. And again, that needs to be culturally product and market aware, as well as suited by the payment method that's going to underlie it. So all of this is just in service of saying that it's important how you handle these choices across your billing system, but certainly with payments, to balance between location and method specific needs, business specific needs, and standardization for a shared global scaled behavior. Thus, when you need a billing and customer subscription management platform or layer that manages the logic for routing and reaction above the payments interaction and above the tax interaction, but it should be paired with partners, especially a payment partner who can offer you the most flexibility and impact from each of these integration points, like our co-hosts at Worldline. So with that, I will hand it over to Michael to dive into the challenges and opportunities with these high growth markets.
Thanks a lot, Mike. I have to say, I really enjoyed that. It's kind of a webinar for me when we at Worldline work with Aria, for example, different subscription billing platforms. You know, it's a bit of a black box. We understand how we tag on at the end, and there are quite a few synergies between our companies, but it was interesting for me to hear you talk about things like setup and the processes and construction of hierarchies. So yeah, I'd like to just sort of publicly thank you for that as well. By the way, I did see a question come in from, I'm not sure if it's Ivan or Yvonne. I'm sorry, I don't know how you say your name. We are spot on time. So I'd also like to thank Mike Judge for that. We've got 15 minutes carved out at the end for Q&A. So we will get to your question. And I would also take this as an opportunity to encourage everyone else that's attending the webinar to throw your questions in along the lines of what Mike Carroll spoke about at the beginning, and we'd be happy to answer them. So please, questions are welcome, and we'll answer them at the end. So as I bring us to the close of at least the scripted portion, or the somewhat scripted portion of the webinar, what I will attempt to do on this slide is talk a bit about the payments ecosystem as it relates to, and then I will take us into a little bit, I will take us out of the shallow water and into some deeper waters around two specific, one is a country, being India, and one is called a geography or a region, which is Latin America. So I'm going to go left to right. I would imagine that most of you read that way, so probably it's the most intuitive. And I'll start with payment methods. And what I'd like to do is really just level set on the definition of payment methods. Given the time that we're doing this, I would guess that we're mostly speaking to folks in the US, certainly could also be people in Latin America, and maybe some very diligent colleagues of ours out in Europe. But if we're talking about this from an American perspective, one of the biggest surprises that we encounter from a payment standpoint when talking to businesses that are really looking to move beyond just, let's say, the US, Canada, and maybe Western Europe, is the prevalence of payment methods beyond just sort of credit and debit cards in other markets. And nowhere is that more true than in the developing markets, which is quite intuitive actually, because if you think about how e-commerce evolved, it started in kind of the major markets. It started in the US, it started in the UK and Australia. That's where it became big. I'm not saying it didn't exist in other countries, but that's really where it exploded. And so what the main pioneers of e-commerce did is they took the offline payments environment with credit cards and debit cards, which is how we pay, you know, at the store, at the restaurant, and they just converted that into the environment, the electronic environment. And that worked fine. But what you see now is that as these markets mature, like the BRIC markets that I was speaking about earlier, they are in a position where as they grow, they have more e-commerce first platforms that allow them to really integrate some of the latest developments, the payment methods that are emanating from some of the hottest startups into their region, their geography, their corridor, which makes them quite exciting, but it also means that it's more complex to expand into those regions. So very quickly, definition of payment methods, it's how you pay, obviously. And a lot of them are actually tied back to credit cards and debit cards, but what we see in the market is the prevalence of a number of things. One of them would be real-time bank transfers, which is basically a technology that connects your bank account with, typically it's some sort of a platform that can pull funds out of your bank account, have recognition of good funds quite quickly, and really streamline the process of payments. You also have e-wallets, which, like I said before, oftentimes tie back to credit cards and debit cards. So you will load a wallet sometimes through another wallet, actually. That's how complex the environment is now. But you'll load a wallet that wallet sort of has a unique identifier, and it allows you to pay on a number of websites and applications and whatnot through that specific wallet. Another thing that's really gaining prevalence now is open banking, which I think is probably a topic for an entirely different webinar. Basically opens up the APIs of different banks in order to allow for, right now, a quasi-instant and soon to be a fully instant payment environment. So suffice it to say that in all of the growing markets, it's crucial to have the preferred local payment method or methods of the consumers in that region. And I think to be blunt, if you're looking to launch into one of these markets and you don't have the number one or number two payment method in that market outside of credit cards and debit cards, A, you're not going to be seen as a local player. B, you're not going to be seen as a player who wants to be local. And C, it's quite likely that your launch into that market will be suboptimal. Maybe it won't fail, but it won't be as good as it could be. So that's the, I guess, the salmon-colored box. And not because they're two similar shades of blue-ish green. I'm actually going to combine cross-border restrictions on cross-border and limitations of privacy into one because they're quite, let's say, synergistic with each other. So the next thing that I'll do in terms of sort of definitions, and bear with me, I know that definitions can be a bit tedious, is just to define from a payments perspective what the difference is between local and cross-border. So first of all, if you're using a local payment method, oftentimes you don't have the option to be doing so cross-border. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So to be quite concise, I'll talk about this from a credit and debit card standpoint, which rely on what we call the schemes. The schemes are names that you know, like Visa, MasterCard, and Discover. There's some that you might not know. I'll talk about the Indian scheme in a moment. And they're companies, obviously, they're really behemoths. And really what they are networks. What they've done is they've created a set of rules, and oftentimes they match each other, and they have rules around what allows you to be a local player. And oftentimes that means having an entity in country. If you have an entity in country, you qualify for better rates. Those rates are called interchange. I won't go into that. And so if you're fully local with a local entity and the correct sort of tax setup and all these things that Mike was talking about before, you qualify to process payments locally. And like I said, there's all sorts of advantages to that. If you're cross-border, basically what will happen is a number of things, but one of the main things that will sort of be a consequence to you and your customers is that the fees imposed upon you by these behemoths are higher. Another thing that you're going to need to contend with is FX, which is something that's very near and dear to my heart. You can look at my LinkedIn if you want to know why. But FX is also its own webinar in and of itself. One I've done, actually, so maybe you could find it if you're interested. Basically, if you're not able to process locally, you're going to have to contend with many different aspects of FX, including how do you price your product locally, what does that mean in terms of your sort of profitability metrics, and when it comes to subscriptions, things like how often am I refreshing my FX rate, how often is it okay and acceptable for me to change my price in the local market. I'll give you one sort of example of where this becomes a bigger issue, would be Brazil. So interesting set of regulations in Brazil that if they see let's say a cross-border company trying to sell to a Brazilian in the local currency, which is Brazilian real, they will try to decline the transaction. They're not 100% effective, but what you see is that the authorization rate of offering Brazilian real to a Brazilian consumer, if you're cross-border, is actually lower if you offer, let's say, US dollars. And again, this is a webinar in itself, but let's just say that these complexities are things to contend with, and of course the call to action here is, I'll harken back to what Mike Judge said. If you find yourself contending with these complexities, it's crucial that you work with payment partners and with subscription billing platforms that are able to contend with them. So with that being said, I will jump into two specific examples that I have. The first being India, and that's on the next slide. Mike Carroll, thank you, sir.
Here you go.
Appreciate it. So I'm going to dive into three things quite quickly. We've got about 6 minutes to go. And I think that we can use the visual on the screen as a guide. But in my notes, I've really summarized the aspects of India and the intricacies of India payments into three buckets. One is local, the second is cross-border, and the third is alternative methods of payment. Hopefully, if I did my job correctly, you will have a bit of an understanding of what each one of those means, which will sort of facilitate a bit of speed on my part as we flow through. So if I start with local as it pertains to India, one of the things to keep in mind is that I mentioned a regime of currency controls in India before, and one of those restrictions is that the local currency, INR, the Indian rupee, it cannot be sent out of India. So whereas if you look at something like the US dollar, which is often referred to as the reserve currency of the world, there's many foreign accounts that hold US dollars. It's not possible with INR. And so this is something that you need to consider if you're looking to go into India, establish your own, let's say, Indian entity. How will you deal with repatriation of funds? The other option, of course, is cross-border. And as I mentioned before, there's the FX implications and the authorization rate depreciations that you might see. There are solutions in the market that acknowledge the fact that the sort of currency environment in India is maybe less than favorable for outsiders trying to break in. A lot of that's by design, by the way. But there are solutions that you can access. Worldline has one such solution, but from an informational perspective, there are solutions that you can access that may allow for local processing without the need for a local entity. And you can see sort of in the second bronze box there some letters that some of you may recognize as currency codes, INR, and then you see at the bottom EUR, GBP, USD. These are currencies that certain providers can sort of convert INR into and then repatriate funds on behalf of a merchant. Lastly, talk about APMs. The National Payments Corporation of India, which is owned by the Indian Central Bank, they've created two very prevalent payment methods and really supported them and propped them up in India. That's RuPay, which is the local card brand of the card scheme, so the Indian equivalent of Visa and MasterCard. And the second is UPI, which is the acronym stands for United Payment Interface, not to be confused or conflated with Union Pay International. A lot of people see UPI and they think, oh, okay, Union Pay International is prevalent in India. It's actually not. And so the takeaway here is that if you want to break into India, like I said before, and act like a local, it's crucial to offer the local card scheme, which is RuPay, and offer UPI, which is the local real-time bank transfer product. If we move on to the last slide, talk a little bit about LATAM. Click.
There we go.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
there was a delay.
Appreciate it. And I've also created 3 buckets that sort of summarize the 5 boxes that you see on the screen. The buckets are setup. There's a note that I'll give you on local language, which I have personal experience of. I don't speak it, by the way. And lastly is the payment particularities. That's how I have it in my notes. So hopefully that's fitting. So from a setup perspective, LATAM is quite unique. It is one of the least mature e-commerce markets, although it's growing. It's one of the fastest growing. And because of that, there are different players that have different setups in that market. So I think it's very true to say that the payments ecosystem in LATAM is very much dictated by the capabilities of the payment providers that are there. And so the 3 sort of setups that I'll talk about are the gateway setup, which is basically a setup that works only if you have a local entity in each of the countries within LATAM that you're looking to expand into. Essentially, a payment provider will have a connection into what are called the acquiring banks in those countries. They'll allow you through one technical gateway to connect to each of those with caveat that you use your local entity in that country to, let's say, create a relationship with that acquiring bank. And so that creates consolidation of APIs, but sort of an expansion of the relationships that are needed in order to operate in each of the countries, because you're not just contracting with one payment provider, you're also contracting with, let's say, multiple banks within the region. The second is called full service. Quite simple. You work with a payment provider that has connections directly with these different banks throughout the LATAM region. It's quite rare because there are literally hundreds of them, and you have a contracting relationship exclusively with the payment provider, and they facilitate local payment. This also requires local entities throughout the region. The last is what you might call a money remittance solution, which is quite a unique thing that you see popping up in the market, which allows for what is essentially local processing without the need for a local entity, and also offshore remittance, very similar to what I talked about in India. And as we wrap up, I see that we are at not the allotted time for the session, but the allotted time for the speakers, so that we can hopefully engage in some dialogue with the audience. I put on local language. So Brazil is, I believe, if my numbers are correct, the fastest growing, or maybe because it's at scale now, it's slowing down, but it is, let's say, probably the most important e-commerce market in LATAM. They speak almost exclusively Portuguese there, which is quite divergent from the Spanish that's spoken in the rest of Latin America. So consider local language support to be not necessarily a nice to have, but a must have if you really want to break into Brazil. And maybe not you as a merchant, but you must work with partners that have that capability. And lastly, we talk about the payment particularities. I've touched on a bit of this already. When I talked about UPI, I talked about sort of the instant real-time payments in India. Brazil has something similar. It's called Pix. It's also state-sponsored, which seems to be a trend in these countries. And the last thing that I also spoke about in the beginning is something that we've mentioned, boletos in Brazil, and also OXXO in Mexico. These are voucher-based payment methods where you basically commit to paying through a system where you print a voucher and then bring it to a convenience store, and then that gives you the ability to pay with cash. If you're not from the market or don't do business there now, that might seem quite strange. I can promise you that those methods of payment are oftentimes preferred in a lot of the countries throughout Latin America. So with that, I will wrap up 2 minutes over time. I do apologize. We don't have too many questions, but I'd like to thank everyone again for your attention and attendance, and look forward to getting to some of the questions that came in.
Yeah, we did. Thank you, Michael. That was great. And we did get a question in the chat window, and then there are a few questions that seem to be coming in the Q&A button down at the bottom there. So I think I'll read out loud the question that came in over chat. What ways do we have to improve conversion rate for recurring payments? I mean, credit card and debit cards, if we have customers email only. And Mike Judge was chomping at the bit to answer this, but we have plenty of mics to put toward this question. So Mike, you want to jump in first? And Mike Judge?
Yeah, why don't I start, and then certainly our payments experts can expand on it. But from a general billing perspective, you generally have what you need. So first of all, I'll point at a webinar we had early in the year that was about the synergies and symbiotic relationship between recurring revenue models and payment methods. And we talked a lot about optimization there. So there may be some useful information in the recorded session there. But generally with optimization, you have enough when it comes to electronic payment methods. The email, don't forget that you just have the email, but you also have the card. And there's nothing more instructive in knowing how to recover a payment method in the credit and debit card world than the card details themselves. And so, you generally can programmatically recover a significant percentage of any of the salvageable failures. And that means targeting why it failed more and a few other things more than who the customer is. So the bin helps knowing what the card, you have that, you know what card issuer is. You generally, we can tell you, and so can Worldline right through us, what level that card is. Sometimes we have more indication in the extended card attributes that tell us the affluence indicator of that customer, but certainly what type of program it is and how that card should respond. And then we generally also have some history on how that issuer has performed. And so with those and the error code, and when I say error code, it's the response code we get back when the failure happened, you generally have enough. And we've worked with a lot of consultants over the years, and we found that the initial failure reason is the most instructive of all of those in how to proceed. So even though error codes might change as you retry a credit card transaction, generally the first one sets you on a path to recovery. And the top two are insufficient funds and a generic decline or do not honor. And you can recover from both of those in many situations, right? Insufficient funds sometimes is a false positive, but sometimes it's transitory. So if you try again at the right time with enough digital grace period, you can recover from that, meaning recognize that people get paid bi-weekly or on the 1st and 15th, and know your audience and allow for your retry period to cover that cycle. Favor certain days of the week, right? Success, you tend to get more success on a Friday than you do on a Saturday and Sunday when it truly is insufficient funds. And with generic decline, it's just knowing again when to reconstruct and when to send it again. So I'll leave it to Worldline too to expand on that. But our bottom line is you have enough information to get most of them. And the more data you have, obviously, the more tailored you can make it. But you can recover a lot and do it programmatically, so the customer doesn't even have to know they're having a passive churn event.
Any further commentary from Worldline on this?
I would maybe ask a question in return, because I've read this over a few times. I'm not entirely clear on the question. I mean, I certainly agree with everything that Mike Judge said, but I'm not clear on what the conversion rate is for recurring payment. I mean, if you only have a customer email address, but I guess they already have payments coming in. So like Mike said, there's a lot of other data. So I would only query why you would only have the email address. So maybe there's something here that we're missing, but other than that, I wouldn't add anything else. So maybe we move on to another question and give Ivan a chance.
Yeah. And if there's more, Ivan could expand more on that.
No, that's a good point.
We do have his identity. We could, based on his name and his registration, we could follow up also offline. We got a couple of other questions. Mike, did I interrupt you? Go ahead.
No, Michael's exactly right. I assumed that we're talking about overall success rate. And as Michael said, you actually have a lot more than you think you do, and probably enough. It's because automated credit card and debit recovery tends not to involve the user. You want to do it programmatically when you can. You don't want to create a possible churn event. Sometimes you do need to reach out to them, but sometimes
literally reaching for the wallet could be a problem, or somebody hesitates.
Correct.
Yeah, and this is Mike Conley with Worldline. A couple other things, business intelligence tools that will show you the decline codes and how to functionally retry. The other thing would be like account updater where it's available, not in LATAM, but having account updater so the card is automatically updated if it's expired or stolen or whatever. So those are a couple other tools that you have at your disposal.
Yeah, and that's a great one that you bring up. But what a lot of people don't know is that account updater generally keeps the data, and this is where the credit card associations will retain data on changes to the card and tell a merchant when there's a new card. It only stays there for 6 months. And so, yeah, to Michael's point, Michael number 2, often, especially if you're talking about an annual or a quarterly subscription, things could have changed since the initial one, and you would have missed an update. And so you always, when there is a failure, want to check again. And our system generally will check out if the provider supports it, like Worldline does, to get a fresh account updater response. It adds some time to your cycle because there's a turnaround time to it, but it's a chance for you to automatically fix and get that new card number without the end user having to do a thing.
Well, let me go to another
Thanks.
question that came in on the Q&A button. And I remind everyone, please try to use that Q&A button to add your questions. One of them was, you mentioned a payment method, money remittance. How can international merchants benefit from that?
I think that's a question for me. This is Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, like I mentioned, in a lot of these regions, there are significant hurdles, and when there are hurdles, you have intuitive and you know, interesting tech-focused companies that will try and create solutions, right? I mean, that is the buzzword of the last 10 years is solutions, and sometimes people use that quite liberally. But one of the solutions, actual solutions that you see in the market, I've seen it in Brazil, I've seen it in Russia, I've seen it in India, are these, in quotes, money remittance solutions that allow for what you call local processing, which I described in some level of detail during the webinar, without the need to have a local entity. And it also allows for offshore remittance while still complying with the tax and data warehousing regulations that are specific to that country or region. So, you know, the money remittance name just simply comes from the fact that the money coming from the sale of the payment, sorry, that generates the payment, is being remitted offshore. And on the back end, there are some complexities that are worked out by the payment provider. Oftentimes they have their own local entity, they have their own data warehousing, they have their own licenses with local government regulators that allow for them to sort of circumvent is a bad word. It's not a four-letter word, but it's a bad word because it often has really negative connotations, but really it is truly technically correct that you're able to get around a lot of the regulations that weren't necessarily meant to keep non-local companies out, but that in effect actually do that. So certainly has solutions like this, and I imagine they'll become more prevalent in the market as we move forward.
Thanks for that answer, Michael. Yeah, I think we're getting a positive response on that. There was another question in here that was, we are already operating with subscriptions business model. What do you think we need to do about with respect to 3D Secure? Who wants to take that one? Mike Judge, maybe?
And this I'll largely defer to the payment experts, but certainly 3D Secure is required in some areas and expected in others, right? Throughout Asia Pac, it's been, and this is the card association-led authentication at point of sale, typically only at the initial sale, not for recurring ones. They generally tend to be exempt. It has since become required in the EU in certain circumstances, what they call a two-leg transaction, where the issuer and the payment account that you're using, the merchant service account, and this speaks to where Worldline can talk about local entities. If they're both in the EU, then it qualifies and requires upfront 3D Secure screening. So in some cases, you're going to have to do it and then react to it and react to it as best you can. When you don't, it takes careful consideration to see if there's any value to you or to your customers, because the card associations themselves have presented that there's a significant impact on conversion, right? When you make them go through, the more clicks you make a customer go through, especially if it's off to a website that's not necessarily on brand or tied to what they're doing, they fail out and abandon for all sorts of reasons. And so the conversion rate tends to be a lot lower. But that said, where it's required, it's absolutely required, and you have to do it right so that it's not impactful, but also so you can capture that customer. Generally, it's a upfront thing, but it can come back, and you're going to have to manage the whole life cycle. But for the details, I mean, if Michael, if you guys want to say anything about it, you guys are the specialists. We generally just hand over and coordinate our 3D Secures with you.
Sure. Yeah, I can maybe briefly opine on that. So I would point to two things. One, regulations. So I'm sure a lot of folks that are on the Zoom right now, I was going to say the call, are familiar with an acronym PSD2, which is Payment Service Directive number 2. One of the items that's defined within PSD2 is the need for strong customer authentication, which is accomplished by 3D Secure. So yeah, it's a lot of letters and a lot of numbers. But like Mike said, if you have two legs in Europe, meaning the payment provider that you're using and also your local legal entity somewhere within the EU, you're required to use 3D Secure. So it's absolutely mandatory. It does introduce a bit of friction. It's getting better. So within that region, you need to use it. In other regions globally, things vary. One of the areas where 3D Secure can become very useful is if you are a merchant that has a business model that inclines itself towards, let's say, as defined by the behemoths that I talked about before, the card schemes, as higher levels of fraud. Implementing 3D Secure could be a great way to stay on their good side, which is super important, because if you're not and you can't use their rails, good luck. And so, I think it's oftentimes more of a bespoke conversation to have, and oftentimes is eventuated by the circumstances that you're in, either because of your business model, your fraud situation, et cetera. What I will say is that strong customer authentication is going to become more prevalent in the future. That's for sure.
Thanks, Michael. So I see that on the side here, we've got maybe a couple more questions that I think we're going to need to follow up with afterward, because we're right at the top of the hour, at the 1 hour mark. So with that, I think I'm going to say thank you very much to all of our attendees for attending. And thank you very much to Worldline, to Michael Bellata, to Michael Connolly, and to Michael Judge of Aria Systems, from all of us Mikes, to all of you Mikes out there. We'll follow up with the questions as we have them coming in, and we'll be in touch with you later. Thanks, everyone.